Thomas, I take your point about the title. I guess we were over-optimistic, actually, because we thought that the conference would take place after the war. And it is not after the war, it is during the war. I also take your point that it's a protracted war, indeed, but it's, I think the mistake was about the after. So the war is still with us, and this is precisely what we'll be discussing right now during this first session, which will concentrate on the impact or the implications of this war in Ukraine on middle powers in Asia. So we chose to avoid the big power politics. We want to concentrate on the impact on other countries, on the countries that are threatened to be taken in this big power rivalry or big power politics. So for this, we have, I think, an excellent lineup of speakers here in person. We have, to my left, Garima MOHAN, who is Senior Fellow in the Asia Program of the German Marshall Fund of the US. And she will be more or less talking about India, but not more or less, she will be talking about India. And to my right is Shafiah MUHIBAT, whom I guess I can call Fifi? Of course. Yeah, it's easier. And she's now the Deputy Executive Director for Research at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Jakarta. So she will be discussing Indonesia and perhaps a bit broader perspective, the ASEAN perspective. So these are the two speakers in person, and there are also speakers online. I hope they are indeed connected. Yes, John tells me that they are. So let me list them. The first is Tomiko ICHIKAWA, who is Director General of the Japan Institute of International Affairs, JIIA. Next in line is Yujen, who is Professor at the National Sun-Yat-sen University in Taiwan and Executive Director of the Institute for National Policy Research, INPR. The last but not least is Dr. Yeop, who is Research Fellow at the Sejong Institute, and he will be discussing Korea. So this is the list of speakers we have. I will ask them to provide the positions of their respective countries vis-à-vis this war on Ukraine, and perhaps also the implications for them, for each of these countries. I suggest to start by alphabetical order, which is the easiest thing to do, and is the order that is on the program, so let's do that. It's totally neutral as a ranking, so don't over-interpret this, this order. So there will be a first round of initial statements by each of them. So focusing on the impacts of the war in Ukraine on their respective countries, and then there will be an internal discussion, and I will come up with various questions, and then eventually we will take questions from the floor. So first in line is Tomiko ICHIKAWA. So the floor is yours for, I suspect, 5 to 7 minutes, something like this.
Bonjour. Thank you very much, Françoise, for your kind introduction. And I'd like to thank Ifri for inviting me to speak at this event on this very important topic for all of us. So I would like to describe very briefly how this new war, we would call it, of a new invasion by Russia is seen by Japan or Japanese people in Japan, and how Japanese government has been reacting to it. So this Russia's new invasion of Ukraine, it really constitutes a quite flagrant violation of the fundamental principle of international law. I think this recognition is shared among the participants today. And I think it is also widely recognized that the post-Cold War era, the so-called post-Cold War era, which allowed relatively, I would say, relatively harmonious cooperation among the big major powers in upholding the rules-based international order, has really come to an end. And today we see that even the very foundation of the global security architecture centered on the United Nations is threatened. So in contrast to, and also partly because of this stymied UN and particularly its Security Council, those groupings based on shared values of democracy and rules-based order, such as the G7, NATO, and the EU, have been taking quite unprecedented measures, such as, and with determination, I would say, including the economic sanctions and provision of humanitarian assistance and military aid. It seems that the shock of this new all-out war, this war of aggression on the European soil in the 21st century, the manner which was really beyond imagination beforehand, really kind of with this shock, these institutions seem to have rediscovered their respective raison d'etre. So Japan, for its part, is really firmly committed itself to the G7 coordination, and it has been really taking unprecedented measures of its own, in particular with severe sanctions against Russia. This is because the manner in which Russia resorted to the use of force in violation of its neighbors' sovereignty and internationally recognized territory has really given a huge shock to the Japanese government and Japanese people. This has drastically changed Japan's perception of its own security environment and its strategic calculations. Actually, Prime Minister Kishida summarized this in one sentence. Ukraine today, maybe East Asia tomorrow. I think this is a really succinct summary of how the Japanese government and Japanese people see the situation. And yesterday at the United Nations, Prime Minister Kishida also said that we stand at a historic watershed moment. So this is a recognition. Japan has been actually already in the middle of the intensifying US-China competition for some years now, with implications not only for its security, but also for its economy. But this all-out war in Ukraine, this aggression by Russia, has totally different and profound implications for Japan. Japanese government has been in the process now of reviewing its national security strategy and national defense program outline and the medium-term defense program, so-called national security 3 documents. So the review of these 3 documents had been already planned to take place this year before the Russia's invasion started. But the fundamental assumptions about the Japanese security situation has really drastically changed with this war in Ukraine. So the Japanese public opinion is generally quite supportive of the need to drastically and speedily strengthen Japan's defense capabilities based on a realistic review of its security environment and without excluding any options. So this has a quite strong support in Japan. Just let me touch upon one aspect of the Japan's security environment regarding Japan-US alliance and the security situation in the region. So despite this drastically changed security environment in Europe, the US continues to describe China as the most consequential strategic partner, and the US reaffirmed its commitment to the Indo-Pacific. However, it is also clear, seen from us in Asia, that the US will need to continue to commit considerable resources in Europe for probably many years to come, not only the immediate assistance to Ukraine or NATO countries, but in the longer term. So the US is expected to pursue even more strongly its effort to get the US allies, both in NATO and in Indo-Pacific, to do more, to share the burden of security. In the Indo-Pacific region, there is no collective security architecture like NATO. So it is essential not only to strengthen individual alliance or partnership with the US, like Japan-US alliance, but also to develop and expand a network of defense and security cooperation among like-minded countries to support the US hub and spoke alliances. So for Japan, in addition to strengthening its bilateral alliance with the US, Japan is already doing so. Japan also needs to promote closer cooperation with like-minded countries in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. In the Indo-Pacific, it is through like the Quad with US, India, Australia, but also with individual countries in the region, like Philippines and other countries in ASEAN. We are also building up our cooperation, security cooperation with these countries. And also like Indonesia, the Philippines, and all these countries, we are also building up for the maritime cooperation in a more kind of wider security area. So, and also we need to continue to engage attention of the European countries like France in the Indo-Pacific in mid to long term, while we fully recognize that you are most preoccupied by your pressing security concerns at home and near at home. But it is essential that we continue to engage France and other European countries in the Indo-Pacific. So today's opportunity is all the more welcome from this point of view. I stop here. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Tomiko, for this very clear statement, and we'll see in a minute whether the countries in the region see eye to eye with you on this enhanced cooperation within the region, and whether we can see some kind of architecture emerging in this region. But before we do that, let me give the floor to Yujen Kuo from Taipei. So Yujen, the floor is yours to provide the
morning,
second
Françoise.
view of an ally of the US.
Can you hear me well?
Yes, we see you, we hear you, everything is perfect. So go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. Honor again. And I'm sorry I couldn't make it there to Paris, but I'll catch you up later in October anyways. I was assigned by Jung to answer a couple of questions regarding Taiwan's position in Ukraine war. And I want to share my talk points. Can you all see my talk points? Okay,
yes,
so
yes, that's fine.
Okay, so I will start because I only got a couple of minutes. First of all, of course, Taiwan stands with Ukraine. And as Ambassador Wu just introduced, Taiwan joined the sanction against Russia starting from March 1st. And we impose export restriction on 57 categories, especially strategic high-tech items, dual-use items, and possible components for WMD. And second of all, Taiwan made our civil society's donation to Ukraine accumulated to $31 million in a month. And Taiwan also donated security equipment to Ukraine, including attacking drones and also reconnaissance UAVs. Second point I want to make is the debates at Taiwan. That is a little bit tricky. As everyone says, Ukraine today will become Taiwan tomorrow. At Taiwan, this statement actually largely intertwined with the cross-strait relation. So I make the table there to show you. Our official stance, the government's official stance is focusing on common values. but the opponents are focusing on law of jungle, which is side with Beijing. So the Ukraine war to Taiwan is autocracy versus democracy. But for all those opponents, they believe the weak shall obey the strongs. And for our official stance, the war itself is an invasion, Russian invasion to Ukraine. But by the law of jungle, they believe that the Ukraine provoked Russia and triggered the war. And we focus on sovereign state, Ukraine as a sovereign state. But those believe in the law of jungle, believing that the war is a proxy war of the US and other European countries versus Russia. And the war to us is a resistance to invasion. But for those believing in law jungle, believing peace is the most important thing. And the war itself is unnecessary casualties. And for our official stance, Ukraine seeking for international support, including joining NATO. And for those believing in law or jungle, they believe it's a provocation. And we believe Ukraine is defending their democracy, but the opponents believe US is not reliable, especially when it comes to China's invasion to Taiwan. And my third point is I will, because I only got a couple of minutes, so I will jump to Taiwan's foreign policy after the Ukraine war. We focus on sovereign state, Taiwan as a sovereign state, security, and Taiwan's reaching out to international community. So our foreign policy after February 24th, becoming more and more security-oriented foreign policy, but at the same time, again, intertwined with cross-strait relations. So we have more and more connection to Eastern and Northern Europe. And we set up a new representative office, and we have congressional interaction with Ukraine. And we have more and more congressional diplomacy with the States, with France, with Japan, Australia, and other democracies. And the government of Taiwan now is pushing for Taiwan's application to UN as a sovereign state. My fourth point to make here is strategic implication of Ukraine war to Taiwan. The answer is very clear. It's self-determination. The Ukraine war basically is standing out Taiwan's three major identities, including democracy, technology, and a maritime nations, occupying very important geostrategic importance. And in terms of defending our democracy, our government already decided to beef up, to increase our military budget next year, which will occupy 2.4% of our GDP. It's 18.9 billion at 2013. And the government is applying asymmetric warfare to increase our stockpile of our missiles. We will increase more than 1,000 units in 3 years. And we are researching on possible drones against China's intrusion to Taiwan's southwestern ADIZ. And Taiwanese government decided to concentrate strategic high-tech industry at Taiwan. So in the coming 4 years, TSMC will establish 18 new factories in advanced process semiconductors from 6 nano to 2 nano. And our government already established 5 colleges of semiconductor this month, starting from September. The semester already started at 5 national universities. And thirdly, in terms of Taiwan's geostrategic importance, I don't need to explain more if you look at how China was doing this military drill starting from August 4th to 8th. And my last point to make is also corresponding to the questions from Jung is Taiwan's position in a divided international system. And I want to emphasize again, Taiwan's 3 major identities were standing out even more with the international system becoming more divided. So we are looking at the US Senate, the Taiwan Policy Act, suggesting to provide military assistance to Taiwan. And also in the content, also mentioned the 1971 UN Resolution 2758 does not include Taiwan representative. And the US government is now considering to include Taiwan in IPEF in CHIP 4. And we already reached conclusion on the 2022 US-Taiwan Initiative on 21st Century Trade. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Yujen, for this, these explanations about Taiwan's position. But we will have more time to discuss Taiwan in the session, in the second panel. So there will be ample time to go deeper into this, this discussion. So third in line is Garima. Garima, where is India? So far it was pretty much okay with Japan and Taiwan siding with the US quite clearly, siding with Ukraine quite clearly. Well, India's case is slightly more complicated, the way I understand it. So could you provide us some explanations about this multi-alignment, or sometimes called self-alignment of India? So.
Yes, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone, and it's a pleasure to be in Paris and see a lot of familiar faces in the room. Working on India over the last couple months has been interesting, to say the least. Being based in Europe, there has been a lot of reporting, a lot of talk about how to understand India's position and what does this, the nuance that is needed to understand where India stands. I'll try to provide it in 5 to 7 minutes that have been allocated. I would start with talking about India's position and then really focus on the impact of this war on India, which is something that is quite often underestimated, particularly among India's Western partners. The Indian position on the war has changed significantly as the war has evolved. I think this is very important to keep in mind. The statements coming out of the Indian government earlier had a very different purpose in view when it was thought perhaps the conflict won't last as long. But as the war has continued, has become more protracted, the atrocities, violence has increased, India's position has shifted as well. For observers of India, this is an important shift. Perhaps for Western commentators, it's not as drastic as they would like to see. However, India does talk about sovereignty, territorial integrity, and now in the statement in Samarkand that the Indian Prime Minister made, also spoke that this is not the era of war. I think people want stronger statements, but this change from the earlier positions has actually been quite remarkable. When it comes to understanding the India-Russia relationship, even before the war, one has to note that it is quite rooted in nostalgia, and the relationship does not play up to India's other strategic partnerships. It had become very one note, focusing mostly on defense technology and supplies. And the Indian partnership, in terms of economics, where do people want to take business, trade, culture, people-to-people ties, it was not Russia, it was more the West. And the partnership had increasingly become one note. And that is important to understand as we now look at, India's reaction to the war. The defense partnership is an important part, which is becoming an issue for India and is, in fact, impeding India from perhaps making stronger statements and taking stronger actions as it would like to. Now let me come to the impact of the war. Immediately, India felt the impact of the war in Ukraine because 20,000 Indian students were in Ukraine and needed to be evacuated. Let me also point out that 20,000 Indian students in Ukraine is more than what India had in Russia. By the way, the students, people, everybody is choosing to go to other destinations. So this is, of course, still a domestic issue as the students have come back, and the question of their education, how to continue it, is a thing that India is grappling with. But of course, the bigger consequences of war, food shortages, fertilizers, the big grain producers will be hit by a fertilizer shortage in another year. Wheat, how to deal with that. Energy prices, as Europe diversifies away from Russia to the Middle East. What would that mean for countries like India, whose energy basket is rooted very much in the Middle East? If those prices go up, what would that mean? On a lot of these questions, of course, Indian officials would say that this is not a regional conflict. This is a global war impacting all theaters. The impact of the war is felt in terms of day-to-day prices in India. But I think the biggest impact of the war will be on the geopolitics of South Asia. And this is something that India is very, very keenly observing. Now, the growing Russia-China partnership was a concern to India even before this war. And now it has become very, very stark. As Russia's options of having other partners is reducing and China-Russia partnership is becoming more and more prominent, this will have very real consequences for India's security, the environment that India is operating in, the geopolitical environment, Pakistan, China, Russia, that will have very real consequences on India's security calculus. And this is something that India is looking at very carefully. Now, the border crisis that happened between India and China, which, by the way, is still ongoing, there has been some sort of deconfliction in one part, but the rest of it is still going on. And it was not very heavily reported here in European media, but this is why India needs reliable supplies of defense equipment, which is what explains India's dependence on Russia in many ways. And again, the war in Ukraine will impact these defense contracts. It is already going to impact the supplies when they reach India, if Russia is able to, fulfill these obligations. And what happens when the Russia-China partnership intensifies and maybe China says to Russia, stop these supplies? What happens then? I think it is a very volatile situation that India is dealing with, and which also perhaps explains the reluctance we see from the Indian side to have more strong statements on Russia. And then I think finally an impact that is going to become very difficult for India going forward is to walk the tightrope it is walking right now. Right now, it is managing to participate in SCO, in the Vostok exercises. At the same time, have a Quad senior ministers working group, 2+2 dialogue with the US, 2+2 dialogue with Japan, participation in RIMPAC, Pitch Black, other exercises, sort of trying to engage more and more with the West, invest more equities in the West, continue investing more in developing its partnership with the West, while at the same time balance its old partner. By the way, diversifying defense doesn't happen overnight. It will take more or less maybe 7, 8, 10 years. What does that leave, what options does that leave India with? This tightrope will become more and more difficult to walk. I would like to quote Foreign Minister Jaishankar when he spoke at the Bled Forum in Slovenia, where he made a very important comment. He said, the dichotomy between the West and the non-West doesn't make any sense anymore. And that, coming from an Indian foreign minister, is a big deal. Coming from a country that was the font of sort of non-alignment of the non-West, was looking at, at one point, BRICS and these options were supposed to be alternatives to the Western order. The fact that the foreign minister said that and said the West non-West dichotomy doesn't make sense. We want to embrace a stronger partnership with Europe. We want to invest more with our Western partners. I think that was very significant, and it is. This was before the conflict in Ukraine, and that showed the overall trajectory of Indian foreign policy, which was leaning towards the West, but of course now puts India in a difficult position. It's a quandary how to get out of it. There are no easy ways, and therefore the impact of this will be felt not only in India's geopolitical neighborhood, but on its foreign policy in the years to come. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Garima, for trying to make sense of this Indian foreign policy and highlighting this the tightrope that India is walking. Indeed, it's quite tricky. Well, I would like to push you perhaps a little bit more into non-alignment and all this, but we'll do that perhaps later. So now, Fifi, the floor is yours. Next in line, Indonesia, big country again.
Thanks so much, Françoise. A very good morning to everyone. Thank you again to Ifri for the invitation to be here. It's a great pleasure to be part of this very, I think, interesting session this morning. I think in terms of distance, of course, Indonesia is very far away from both Ukraine and Russia. So when the Indonesian president visited both Ukraine and Russia in the end of June, of course, he created a lot of headlines. And it's particularly interesting to read the narratives in the media, both the local media and international media as well. Some applauded him as the first Asian leader to make the trip to both capitals since Russia's invasion to Ukraine. While others, and I think this is partly a little bit more common, there are critics that questioned Indonesia's ability to make any impact on the conflict. So basically the big question is, what was he doing there? What was he trying to achieve? So I think it's fair to ask the question, what were the factors behind this visit? So an ideal, ideal explanation would be for Indonesia as a country to take part in peacemaking role and so on, and contributing to global interests of peace in Ukraine. Again, this is ideal. However, a more realistic take points us to some more apparent objectives of the visit, which lie closer to home. In fact, reading the official statements of the president leading up to the visits, both from the president and from the foreign ministry, it was pretty clear that creating world peace was not the main objective. In his press statement at the airport just before departing, when he went first to Germany for the G7 meeting and then to Ukraine and then to Russia, the president explained that finding a solution to the global food and energy crisis was a priority. Alongside, with calling for a start for dialogue among the conflicting parties. So I think this is something that I need to underline here. Food and energy crisis are impacts of the war that is directly felt in Indonesia. Indonesia's food security has long been a source of concern. It still relies heavily on imports for staple food to meet domestic demands. So Jakarta has actually been disturbed in the past month by several on-street demonstrations protesting against the rise of both fuel prices, which means the reduction of fuel subsidy, and the rise of food prices. So this is a very direct impact felt in Indonesia. Another domestic interest which led to the president's visit to both Ukraine and Russia is the success of Indonesia's G20 presidency. Depicted by the forthcoming G20 summit in November in Bali. We know with the war, the chances of G20 being a business as usual finance summit are basically non-existent. It's not going to happen that way. A few months ago, if we recall, even Western leaders had threatened to actually boycott the summit if President Putin was there. Of course, this stance has shifted since, as the majority of Western non-attendance at the summit is now seen as giving free platform for Russia to engage with the rest of the G20 leaders. So that problem has partly been solved one way or the other. So during his visit, the president invited both presidents, both leaders, Zelensky and Putin, to actually attend the summit, as he was looking to accommodate the concerns of the West and persuade all of them to actually attend the summit, while at the same time maintain relations and communications with Russia. So what I need to underline here is a failed G20 summit, meaning no show by a lot of leaders, would be seen as a national embarrassment. And I think this is something that is very much highlighted by the local media as well. So with these factors, I think the most evident that we need to underline is that for Indonesia, domestic audience and domestic interests still come before global audience and global common interests. So that's the first part of my short remarks. The second is because I think it would be also interesting to sort of like assess the war's broader implication for regional order in Southeast Asia, and the impact on ASEAN, which is the regional grouping in Southeast Asia, and how the relations among these countries with both Ukraine and Russia is seen. Southeast Asia has always attempted to balance among great powers. That's one of the main objectives why the grouping, the bloc, was created back in 1960s. And now many analysts have only noted ASEAN's weak condemnation of Russia's aggression and its reluctance to name it as aggressor. This is something that is written in some of the joint statements coming from ASEAN. So as a bloc, the response has been, you can call it weak, if not non-existent in these joint statements. At the individual country level, responses have varied. At the one end, we have Singapore, who has imposed sanctions on Russia, but even Singapore have not directly claimed to choose a side. So they impose sanction, but not making any clear statements of choosing a side. Their decision to impose sanction is seen as, as avoiding to having to align with the West. It's basically, we think it's to demonstrate its ability to conduct an independent foreign policy. On the other hand, we have, of course, Myanmar, which lent Russia its full support, calling the invasion justified in some of its documents. Although this should be pointed out that this is the position of the current military junta in Myanmar, which is completely different from the statements coming from the National Unity Government. So you see these two extremes of responses. All the other ASEAN member states are somewhere in between. There are, of course, countries like Indonesia, as I mentioned, attempted to have some sort of a role. Vietnam has attempted to make some efforts as well, but the others remain very passive and some even indifferent towards the whole conflict. Let me remind you again that this region is completely far away from the ongoing conflict. So in essence, Southeast Asia has, maintained some sort of neutrality, if we can call it that, in the war. So in terms of the regional political security dynamics, I have to say there has been very little impact, if none at all. ASEAN meetings will go on as usual. Putin is invited to every ASEAN meetings. There will be an ASEAN-Russia meeting coinciding with the ASEAN summit coming November. There will be the East Asia summit, of course. There will be APEC, of course, coming on also in November. And so I think from a regional political security dynamics, very little impact. However, again, in other aspects, there are definitely impacts. As I mentioned, rise in price of commodities, disruption in supply of commodities have drastically affected Southeast Asian economy. So it's going to be easy to find some reports on this as well. Moreover, a broader Europe downturn will also have a large knock-on effects on ASEAN's exports, foreign direct investment and growth. So another issue worth mentioning, but I won't go into details on this first remark, is regarding Russian arms sales in the region as well. So of course, later on, we can discuss that, and also the question, simple question, should ASEAN have taken a stronger stand? So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Well, that would have been a surprise if ASEAN had taken a very firm stance. That would have been the first time. Anyway, well, I have also plenty of questions. But the last, but not least, of course, speaker is Dr. Wu. So, Dr. Wu, the floor is yours. Same thing, 7 minutes max.
Hello, can you hear me now?
We can hear you. Yes, no problem.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for Ifri to having me for this important dialogue with many renowned experts. Let me start by explaining how Koreans view the war in Ukraine. First, as you might already know, President Yoon Suk-yeol won the election on March 10th with a very narrow margin. It's 48.4 versus 47.8, which is about 0.6 percent point margin, which is the narrowest margin in Korea's history. What that means is that South Korea's conservative and the progressive has divided South Korean population just in half. That means half of Koreans, especially those who didn't vote for the President Yoon, has a very different views on the global affairs and the direction of South Korea's foreign policy. For example, during the campaign period, the opposition candidate, then ruling party.
Oh, you're frozen.
The President Zelensky lacked knowledge in politics and diplomacy, provoked Russia. The Ukraine president is responsible for the outbreak of war. That was the comment by then ruling party candidate. And when the war broke out, and then international community put sanctions on Russia, then South Korean President Moon Jae-in did not join that international sanction onto Russia because he was worried that South Korean business with Russia would be damaged by imposing sanctions on Russia. But about 2 or 3 days later, when the United States put sanctions on those businesses who continue to have business with Russia, then South Korea joined the sanctions. So historically, South Korean progressive who has like antipathy toward the US and the alliance with the United States tried to limit the scope of alliance only on the peninsula. From their point of view, South Korea's interest only can be secured when South Korea make itself have a distance from the global affairs. On the other hand, South Korean conservative try to find its role in the global arena, try to expand the role of the alliance, and South Korea should play that kind of role as a responsible state. So South Korea, these two ideas are evenly divided. So even when President Yoon was elected, it's very difficult in domestic political environment that South Korea's interest is in that supporting and maintaining the liberal international order. So the term rules-based international order was not that familiar to Korean and Korean politics. But maybe one good element that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was that South Korean people get to know the term rules-based international order and what that meant. So in 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea, not many Koreans actually paid attention to it. And then conservative president didn't really join the international sanctions on Russia. But about eight years later, now at least half of Koreans believe that upholding the rules-based international order is very important. So the President Yoon participated in the NATO summit because upholding liberal international order is very important for South Korea. He believes that South Korea under the liberal international order can grow its economy and can be stable over the past 70 years. So he believes that upholding and maintaining rules-based international order, liberal international order, is very important for South Korea's security and prosperity. So in that way, South Korea started to see that the Russia's invasion of Ukraine is the kind of thing that might alter the international order that can hurt South Korea's security and the prosperity. So during the election campaign, many media, which is also divided in half, try to criticize conservative approach toward the Ukraine. So they asked the question that what would be in South Korea's interest if China invades Taiwan? It was very controversial issues in South Korea because about 20 years ago, when President Nomuyon, who was progressive, was the president, there was this concept introduced in South Korea, which is strategic flexibility. That meant that those US forces in South Korea can be utilized in elsewhere. And then the South Korean government very much opposed it. President Yoon, during the campaign, answered the question regarding Taiwan issue, which is same as his statement at the UN General Assembly very recently. He's opposing any changes of status quo by force. So you might remember that Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan and then visited South Korea. There was a controversy in South Korea because President Yoon didn't meet her because he's on vacation. Very interestingly, South Korean opposition actually praised President Yoon because by not meeting Speaker Pelosi, we avoided the Taiwan question. So still, South Korean opposition has this view that not engaging or not being involved in those affairs will be in the interest of South Korea. However, President Yoon tried to expand its role, and also in that regard, South Korea is trying to improve its relations with Japan because President Yoon Suk-yeol believes that South Korea's good relations with Japan is in our interest, both in security and prosperity. But domestic politics is still very harsh for President Yoon to improve South Korea's relation with Japan. So if I summarize, Russia's invasion of Ukraine now gives some thought in the Korean politics. What would be in South Korea's interest? Whether South Korea needs to be involved in the matter or not. So South Korea under President Yoon is moving more toward the idea that maintaining and upholding rules-based international order is very important for South Korea. But how much South Korea should be involved is the question. As I said, about half of South Koreans oppose any involvement. So we are talking about half of Koreans about these issues. So South Korea is now being in transition phase from the country that only cares for itself on the Korean Peninsula to the country that can contribute to uphold the international order. So it seems like South Korea is not ready and willing to participate in these matters, but I can assure you that South Korea is moving in that direction. Let me stop here and I can answer the questions if someone has questions about Korea. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Wu. Perhaps I would like to ask Tomiko to react to this explanation about South Korea's position. So, Tomiko, are you with us?
Yes.
Yeah, can you react to that? I mean, what will be the impact on South Korea and Japan relations? And so, what your reactions to what Professor Wu just explained? Do you have any comment about that?
What we can see from Japan's perspective regarding point of view regarding the South Korea's internal political situation is that it is also well known in Japan that the public opinion in South Korea is quite divided, which was again as explained by Dr. Wu, as shown by the result of the presidential elections. At the same time, we are hearing a number of messages from the new administration under President Yun, not only about its willingness to improve the bilateral relations, but also its recognition of the need to enhance US, Japan, South Korea security cooperation. So our understanding is that current administration's willingness to improve Japan-South Korea bilateral relation is at least partly in the context of its overall wider strategic policy direction in the Indo-Pacific, including South Korea's bilateral security relations with the US and its perception of this regional security. And from actually my own personal perspective, I think it is also important, particularly for the security area, for Japan and South Korea, together with the US, to discuss further and strengthen our relations. There are, I don't go into that details, a number of difficult political, historical, bilateral issues between South Korea and Japan. At the same time, I believe both countries really feel the need of kind of improving or enhancing our security cooperation, particularly together with the US, in light of the current security environment in this region. So that might be an area where Japan and South Korea can proceed with maybe more speed than any other area. That is my understanding. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Tomiko. Perhaps I'll turn to you, Fifi. Tomiko, in her initial statements, suggested that while Japan was looking for partners in the region, well, okay, South Korea, we saw that the triangle, South Korea, Japan, US, could be perhaps a bit enhanced. And she suggested that Japan might also turn towards Southeast Asia, and she even explicitly mentioned Indonesia. So what would be Indonesia's position in this respect? Would Indonesia be willing to engage in some kind of cooperation in the security realm, I mean, with Japan and other partners in the region?
Sure. I think it depends on what we mean by security cooperation. I mean, Japan has been one of the longest partner for ASEAN. Between ASEAN countries and Japan, there are a very vast list of security projects on security cooperation, both at the ASEAN level and bilateral, ASEAN member countries and Japan. But if what we mean by security cooperation is more in the form of an alliance, then it's a big no-no for a lot of Southeast Asian countries, especially for countries like Indonesia, because that just goes against the principles of many of these countries. But I think, putting that aside, there is, of course, big logic in deepening security relations with countries like Japan, because, from our understanding is that it's actually one of the objectives of ASEAN to actually strengthen relations with the dialogue partners, including Japan.
Thank you.
Sorry. Just let me clarify one point. When I talked
Go ahead.
about security, I didn't mean defense in narrow sense. As was just suggested, I was talking about when I was talking about the more wider network of cooperation. It is more about security cooperation, including maritime security, or even anti-terrorism cooperation. Is more kind of wider sense of security cooperation. At the same time, we have more in-depth discussion, including defense, like with a country like the Philippines, with which we have so-called 2+2 dialogue. So, but there are different means, different areas to cooperate. It was what I wanted to say, sorry.
Yeah, so you had non-traditional security in mind as well. I mean, this kind of issues, okay. All right. Garima, you want to react to that? How India would position itself in this story? I mean, how does that relate with what you described as India's position with multi-alignment, so to speak, I mean, various formats and various partners?
I wouldn't use the term multi-alignment myself. I think what India has been doing is diversifying partnerships, which is what every country is doing now. When we look at European Indo-Pacific strategies, we ask, why is Europe interested? The first answer is diversifying our partnerships. India's been doing that as well. In the Indo-Pacific, continuing on the conversation with Japan and India have a very, very strong partnership. India-Australia has strengthened a lot. Within ASEAN countries, Indonesia, Vietnam, India-US partnership has strengthened a lot. And I think in those senses, if you look at these relationships, India has overcome the hesitations of its past. And it is deepening ties with newer partners. The Quad didn't come overnight. It is built on the very strong foundations of increasing security defense cooperation between India and each of these 4 countries. And even though India will never be part of an alliance, similar to what Fifi was saying, it is deepening these networks of cooperation, and it's different from the traditional hub and spoke system. It is minilaterals, as people call it, or plurilaterals, as the Indian foreign minister likes to call. And I think these are the new networks that are very interesting and will be consequential for security in the Indo-Pacific. It makes it very different from the situation in Europe. And the alliance-based systems in Europe. But I would like to say, since my focus is Indian foreign policy towards Europe, we've been mapping this for the last 5 years. We also have a study at the GMF website on this. India's investment in Europe have increased tremendously as well. This is not just about Berlin, Paris, London anymore. The EU-India relationship has qualitatively transformed. India has invested a lot in sub-regions in Europe. The Nordic-India Summit is one example. The Central Eastern European countries are very interesting. At the Raisina Dialogue, which is India's premier foreign policy dialogue this year, the focus was on Europe. President von der Leyen was the keynote speaker. And Lithuania was present, and India decided to open a new embassy in Lithuania, calling this region very strategic. So I think in terms of diversifying partnerships, I have to say the India-Europe one has been quite interesting and very, counterintuitive. I don't think a lot of people expected, even in Delhi, I don't think a lot of people expected Europe would be so interesting.
Thank you. Perhaps I'll ask you one more question, but this is not addressed to all of you. You'll understand right away why. I wanted to have some reactions to President Macron's speech at the UN General Assembly. I guess that everybody knows the gist of his speech, and he kind of forcefully criticized a number of countries which didn't take a very clear stance on the Ukraine war. So I was just wondering whether you have any idea of the reactions in your various capitals to this to this speech. So I quote what President Macron said. He said something like, and it's just one part, countries that refuse to take a side in Russia's war in Ukraine are complicit with Moscow's new imperialism. They are making a mistake that will carry historic responsibility. So have there been any official reactions to this very strong statement? So of course this question is primarily addressed to Indonesia, I guess to some extent to India as well. For the other, and then Korea, the two others are fine. I suspect. So have there been any official reactions? And what do you personally perhaps think of such a statement, which was really particularly impassioned, but a little bit perhaps too strong a statement? So how was it received, if any?
Sure. I mean, to my knowledge, there has been no official statement regarding that from the Indonesian government, but I don't know if there were closed doors discussions within the foreign ministry, so I'm pretty sure there is. Well, I guess looking at it from an Indonesian point of view, it's not the first time we've been accused of being indifferent to a lot of so many other issues. Even those closer to home, like the South China Sea, for example, Indonesia's been accused of not doing enough in actually responding to the issue. So I think, but if looking at previous, we call it incidences of or issues, Indonesia's always put forward the doctrine of independent and active and so on, that we will never openly choose sides in any, especially when it comes to huge geopolitical major power competition, US, China, Ukraine is I think some examples that has to be mentioned here. So yes, to answer your question very simply, no, and I do not expect there to be any sort of like response to that from the Indonesian government, no.
I don't think India saw it as directed against India, because the president also mentioned Prime Minister Modi's comment on this is not the era of war. Also, the India-France relationship is the real special relationship that India has. I think this will not be impacted by that. And the foreign minister's visit to India was very consequential. And I think the Indian foreign minister even said that calling it this just a strategic partnership is not, doesn't convey how important this partnership is. The other point I would like to make, however, is the broader point about Europe wanting to build a coalition of partners resulting in a stronger response to Russia. If you want to build a coalition, obviously this is not the way to go. The way to go is to convince people of the merit of your position. Because a lot of people in Asia simply don't know what's going on in Europe. They don't understand the history of this region. And in the information space, Russian disinformation is doing a lot, in fact. I think it would be better to build, the attempt towards building a coalition of partners who support Ukraine would have to be a bit more positive and, frankly, sharing the history of the region, Europe's point of view, Ukraine's point of view, and countering disinformation. The information space, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, has been pretty much ceded to Russia and China at this point.
Thank you. Dr. Wood, you have anything to add to that? Although I'm not sure that, Korea was targeted. That's not what I meant, but, just to animate the debate. So, Dr. Wood, you have any reaction to President Macron's statements?
Yeah, as you just said, that South Korea already joined the sanctions, and President Yoon himself promised a lot of support to the Ukraine. So, but the thing is, not many Koreans actually know what President Macron said at the UN. So I'm not sure how many Koreans have feelings toward what he meant. But as I said, like half of Koreans have very different idea about South Korea's foreign policy direction compared to half of Koreans. So I think the idea about how to view the Ukraine war is very much different from South Korea in 2014. So more and more discussions are about like how much South Korea should give support to the Ukraine. So the question is not about whether South Korea should support Ukraine or not. It's more about like how and how much and in what way South Korea should give support. So far, many South Koreans agree that giving like financial support or political support might be okay, but whether to give direct military support is okay for South Korea is on the debate. So maybe we have to see.
Well, perhaps we should open to the questions. So you tell me whether there are questions from the virtual floor, and otherwise we'll open to questions here in the room. Okay, David, perhaps first. David Cameron. So please introduce yourself. Well, I know you, but the others do not.
David Cameron from Syria at Sciences Po. There's a convincing argument that could be made that defending the rules-based order, defeating Putin, begins in the heart of the Indo-Pacific. I'm talking about Myanmar. The Russians are the main military supporters of the junta. The Chinese have the good sense to hedge their bets. So, and the military situation is quite similar, actually, according to military analysis, to that in Ukraine. That is, the internal occupier is on the defensive, that is the Tatmadaw, the military, and they only control less than half of the territory of Myanmar. So my question to you is, particularly to Garima and Fifi and Garima, is there a link made in India and in Indonesia with Ukraine and Myanmar and Russian supports? That's the first question. And related to that, is there an evolution now that we're no longer about just restoring democracy, where there seems to be a point of no return in Myanmar? Is there an evolution in Indian foreign policy towards Myanmar as the situation has deteriorated? And the same thing for Indonesia. And the question is Indonesia paying its traditional role in ASEAN on the Myanmar issue, which doesn't seem to be the case with the Malaysians taking a more vocal stand?
Plenty on your plate.
Sure. Okay, I'll try my best. I'm not really the expert on the current ongoing conflict in Myanmar, but regarding, I did mention a little bit about the issue of regarding Russian arms sales in the region of Southeast Asia. Russia has indeed been one of the largest exporters of arms to Southeast Asia over the past 2 decades, I think. But interestingly, that there's a statistic, and I think some colleagues at the ICHIKAWA in Singapore did a study on this, that since 2014, the value of its defense sales to the region has fallen sharply. And I think this same study also summarized that first, Russia's invasion of Ukraine will not only make it difficult for Russia's defense industry to revive sales in Southeast Asia, but also will likely lead to a further decline of arms exports to the region. So that's one of the prediction that this study had. And secondly, the economic sanctions that Russia has now will actually make it harder for Russian defense companies to conduct financial transactions, while export controls will also restrict their access to high-tech components. So again, I'm adding to the possibility or the prediction that the arms sales will fall sharply. And thirdly, I think this is also interesting from this study, is that if Russia becomes more dependent on China for economic and military assistance, due to the sanctions, there is the analysis that Beijing may apply pressure, actually apply pressure on Moscow to reduce the sales of offensive weaponry to Southeast Asia, because this in part also links to some of Beijing's interests in Southeast Asia. Now, specifically on Myanmar, and ASEAN and Indonesia, of course, Indonesia's interest is, for stability to come back to the region. And I think our biggest difficulty or our biggest challenge now is, of course, on what's going on in Myanmar. Yes, Indonesia has actually made several serious efforts to work through ASEAN on Myanmar issues, but of course the challenge lies always on the bureaucracy of ASEAN and the ongoing criticisms about how effective ASEAN can actually be to respond to some of the more serious issues, including like the one in Myanmar. And also, unfortunately, I don't know if this is fortunately or unfortunately, Indonesia is taking, assuming ASEAN chairmanship next year, right? And as always, when Indonesia assumes chairmanship of ASEAN, there's this huge, high expectation of what Indonesia can do. So for the past at least couple of years, the current ASEAN chairs has been putting, it seems from our point of view, has been putting things aside for Indonesia to resolve next year, which is, I think, completely unfair and completely way too high expectation of what we can actually do. Because whatever Indonesia seeks to do through ASEAN, there is a limit of ASEAN bureaucracy to what extent we can actually make some goals achieved.
I'll keep it short, really, to underline what Shafiah said about Russia-China relationship. But on your question of if India sees parallels between Ukraine, Myanmar, not at all. I think that's because there's very little understanding in India of what is going on in Ukraine on the ground. And that links to the point that I had made earlier, that there is a need to really clarify, have a narrative, and share it with partners in the region. Personally, I think a narrative based around sovereignty, territorial integrity would resonate more with the Indo-Pacific than democracies versus autocracies. But there is very little understanding. And I think the more interest that India has is looking at the developing Russia-China partnership in its region, Indian Ocean, Myanmar, other places. I think that is of more interest, but the parallels, unfortunately, are not being drawn.
Okay, next questions, yes? So same thing, you introduce yourself.
Thank you. Two short questions. Michel Wakinski, Journalist International. Thank you, Shafiah MUHIBAT, for your limiting assessment. My question is, what is your assessment on your neighbors? I mean, Malaysia's posture vis-à-vis this conflict. And to Garima MOHAN, what is your assessment of the domestic political divisions on India's postures toward this conflict?
There are also people online. If you want to ask questions to them, you may. And on top of that, let me, so it gives you time to think. So I also remind the audience, the virtual audience, that they can ask their questions through the chat box. So.
Sure. I hope I get the question right. So Myanmar's view on this, recent geopolitical dynamics and so on. But Malaysia, again, I'm pretty sure hopefully there are Malaysian experts also in the audience. But Malaysia has been very much preoccupied by their domestic politics. It's one of the developments that we did not expect in the region, actually, looking at Malaysian domestic politics. And they have since become very unpredictable in terms of their foreign policy as well. Some remains stable in terms of working through ASEAN, their engagement in the region, yes. But other than that, I do think they are very much preoccupied by their domestic politics. Hence, we cannot really expect any sort of like ambitious or big, grand strategy coming from Malaysia in terms of how they approach the current geopolitical dynamics. That's my short answer, I'm sorry.
On your question was on domestic views on India's position on Ukraine. There was actually remarkable unity across political parties behind the government's position. People supported it. Members of parliament largely supported the position the Indian government took. There were only a few voices here or there where you would either see a more pro-Russia voice or more pro-Ukraine in the sense that India should take a stronger position. But other than that, I think most political parties have fallen in this line, which is rare, given how cacophonous the Indian democracy is.
Thank you. So there were other hands raised. Yes, please. So you introduce yourself and ask your question, please.
Song from Fudan University, Shanghai. I have a question for Dr. Mohan and Dr. Guo, my old friend. Okay. The former Deputy Assistant Secretary of the United States Department of Defense, Elbridge Colby, in his new book, he proposed his new book, The Strategy of Daniel. He said, to preserve U.S. hegemony and contain China, it is worth sacrificing Taiwanese lives by provoking a limited war in Taiwan. This book is very popular in China. It's why so many Chinese people think it's the same in the war Ukraine. So do you agree with his opinion? Thank you.
So this is addressed to Garima and to
Dr. Mohan and Dr. Guo. Okay.
Short answer, do I agree with Bridge Covey's opinion? No. But I think the question is more about Taiwan, so Dr. Guo should answer.
I think it's, it's more addressed to Dr. Guo. So Yujen, please, any reaction to that?
Thank you. Definitely not agree. We will defend our country and our democracy, the way of life, as necessary as it could be. So again, as I just presented, self-determination is one of the most lesson and implication that Taiwan learned from the Ukraine war. So again, China shouldn't underestimate the determination of Taiwanese people to defend their country. And can I use more time, because I found this this seminar?
Sure. You may react to things that have been said before.
I actually think this webinar, I mean this conference is very interesting, especially the combination of.
Oh, please go on. I mean, it was positive, so please.
Okay. I believe this combination of participants in this conference is actually very, very interesting. We have India, Indonesia. We can see from the participant, the two participants' reaction to Ukraine war. It's more like a level of relevance. But if we look at Japan and South Korea, it's the level of reluctance. And Taiwan locates at the center stage of possible threat or crisis from Chinese invasion. We do not have that kind of luxury to discuss level of relevance or level of reluctance. So again, I found this conference is actually very interesting, especially when Tomiko was mentioning about Japan has been seeking for partner. And Japan does have a very important partner in terms of security. That's Taiwan. But Japan has been embracing this so-called 1972 system for more than 50 years. I mean, actually, it's a 50th anniversary this year that Japan cuts its diplomatic tie with Taiwan. But we actually have a lot to do with Japan in terms of our common security. And I definitely believe Japan shall make a clear example to other democracies to cooperate with Taiwan. Take something, for example, you basically cannot isolate your southwestern islands security with Taiwan. Look at the Chinese military drill from August 4th to 8th. Their missiles actually falling into your EEZ in your southwestern islands. So we shall work together. I mean, I was proposing to the Japanese government to form a joint venture company at Taiwan with special licensing, allowing Taiwanese cargoes to do logistic support to your southwestern island is much, much better than you do your own logistic support from Okinawa. Because the island chain of your southwestern island is more than 1,000 kilometers. And Japan and Taiwan, we can do together, against China's gray zone activities with much more flexible and creative combinations or countermeasures. But we are not doing it. We are not even discussing it. That's not good. And I think Japan should make a clear example to institutionalize our congressional cooperation. We did have this so-called Taiwan-Japan 2+2 from the two ruling parties, and I definitely believe Japan should make a clear example to our democracies, especially to South Korea, that you still have other flexible way or creative way to cooperate with Taiwan, because both Japan and Korea, you are not far away from the center stage of crisis, unlike Indonesia and India. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Kuo. And I think it was a nice way of categorizing the countries with this level of reluctance, level of relevance distinction. It's a nice way of putting it, and Taiwan in the middle with basically no choice. So I think it's an interesting way of summarizing things. Perhaps, Tomiko, you may want to react to Dr. Kuo's suggestion.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, I cannot represent the Japanese government to answer to his questions if they are addressed to the Japanese government. But as Dr. Kuo himself knows quite well, as one of the leading think tanks in Japan, we at JIIA have been having quite a number of very fruitful discussions with our counterparts in Taiwan all the time. That is one of the roles that we, as track 2 players, can play. Although, as Dr. Kuo enumerated, Japanese government for the track 1 route, they have their own policies and constraints. But just one thing to add is that, as Dr. Kuo mentioned, the Chinese military exercises in August, particularly their missiles, not only the ones that Dr. Kuo mentioned which flew into our EEZ, but also the ones which flew the closest to one of our islands, were quite widely reported to Japan. Actually, I didn't mention that in my initial remarks, but in addition to the war in Ukraine, the impact of these Chinese military exercises are certainly felt in Japan and will be certainly taken into account in the overall exercise of Japanese review of its national security and defense policies. So, while the track 1 channel might be still remained somewhat constrained, I believe that through track 2 and other ways, Japan and Taiwan will need to talk more often and more in depth, and particularly among our kind of own academia who are specialized in security in general and also economic security. There is quite a strong growing recognition that we really need to have more dialogue and more kind of in-depth discussions with our Taiwanese friends. Thank you.
Dr. Wood, you want to add something or not? I mean, Korea was mentioned, or no? I see you nodding. No, everything is okay on your side?
Yeah, so South Korea is So there are two things for the economic security or technology security nexus. So one is that it is very important for the countries, whether the country is a U.S. allies or the U.S. partner or friends. We have like two issues. First, it is important for countries like South Korea to align with the United States because South Korea's like future development or growth in the technology industries are dependent on like U.S. technology. So the keeping the cooperation with the United States is important. But the concerns or the questions about U.S. leadership in that area is that how we can reconcile the differences among ourselves. For example, Fab 4, which is called Chip 4, like semiconductor fabrication countries. So the US, Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea. So on a like conceptual level, we can understand that the cooperation among those four countries who have strengths in make semiconductor is very important. But how we are going to cooperate is a different question. As Dr. Kuo just mentioned that TSMC and Samsung of South Korea are huge competitors in the industries. So whether we can agree on the like abstract concept of this cooperation is very much different from how to actually make certain policy to be implemented among countries. So for example, like TSMC, with a huge subsidy from the Japanese government, decide to make a plant like fab in Japan, right? So it hurts like Samsung's like future competitiveness in the industry. So even if we agree on the concept, but in reality, there's a lot of issues that should be reconciled among the four countries, and those are like business decisions. So there are certain limitations how much government can be involved. So for example, if all the countries decide to pursue certain industrial policies or certain tax incentives for their own economic security or economic growth, it's going to cause problems. So how to secure the cooperation among those countries who agree to the like overarching theme is very much different. So for example, US Inflation Reduction Act just exclude South Korea-made electronic vehicle from the subsidy list from the United States. So South Korea decided to invest in the United States for its automobile plants, but the US just excluded South Korea from the subsidy list, the incentive list. So it can happen all the time when you pursue your own industrial policies to subsidize your own industry. So I think we agree on the concept, but the implementation will be very difficult. Thank you.
Yeah, well, it's a standard issue when you have kind of contradictory interests between governments and businesses' interests. So that's a standard thing, and indeed, I mean, it's a challenge to try to reconcile the two different types of considerations. There was a hand raised at the back, and then at the front. Okay, at the back first. Yeah. So you introduce yourself and ask your question.
Thank you.
Please.
Professor Anne-Marie Brady from New Zealand and also visiting fellow at ICHIKAWA here in Paris. Really interesting discussion and range of views and on a number of topics that I think interest a lot of us. So I was really pleased that Dr. Guo mentioned grey zone and Taiwan because I think that's one of the impacts of the war in Ukraine on Asia and the global order is that it's really forced many countries to face up to the fact of the foreign interference of Russia and China and uncomfortable conversations and uncomfortable issues that have to be confronted. So Taiwan is the expert on China's foreign interference, and having experienced it, for many, many years, and continuing to experience it. And the question I have about Taiwan is, why don't you share that expertise more proactively? Why don't you speak up about it? We have seen a change in Taiwan's diplomacy in the sense that others are coming to Taiwan, the visit diplomacy. But what leadership role can we expect from the Tsai government in the changed global order that we are experiencing? Thank you.
Dr. Kuo?
Thank you. Two very difficult questions, but I will do my best. First of all, in terms of gray zone activities from China, again, we are experienced, but we still need cooperation and collaboration from other democracies. And the key to countermeasure to China's gray zone activities, not whatever your countermeasure is, do not fall in China's prediction. Gray zone is a psychological game. Before they take any action or activities, they make prediction of your reaction. And once your reaction falls into their prediction, you are pumping their confidence. So they will go further. So that's how China changed the status quo East China Sea, because Japan's reaction was just too rigid. Japan responded to Chinese Coast Guard's vessel circulating East China Sea, Chinese military airplane, their vessels circulating East China Sea, air and sea. Japan's response have been all the same in the past 10 years, taking photos, drawing their sailing tracks, and publicize it. And I believe Chinese know very, very well how Japan will react to their gray zone activities. And so they go further and further. And do not forget that the Chinese military vessel sailing, circulating Japan within the 12 nautical miles territorial water. China is not doing this to Taiwan. So whatever you do, do not fall into their prediction, because you are helping them to bully you. So for example, again, I definitely believe this cooperation between Taiwan and Japan is vitally important to two countries. So take East China Sea, for example. If you want to, just being very stubborn, stick to this so-called 1972 system, then we will end up all being bullied by Chinese gray zone activities. So for example, if Chinese aircraft or their vessels coming into East China Sea, so for day one, the combination of countermeasures should be maybe it's Japanese Coast Guard appear. Day two, it will be Taiwanese Coast Guard. Day three, it will be Taiwan and Japan Coast Guard appear together. So you are creating situation for China when they try to conduct gray zone activities. You don't want to give them, every day the same scenario fall into their prediction. So Taiwan alone, we've been dealing with Chinese gray zone activities, and we are trying to make some creative, flexible design of our countermeasures. For example, we do not only do scramble to Chinese aircraft, intruding to our southwestern ADIZ. We are applying drones. We are applying high latitude balloons. So we are trying to make a new combination alone to counter China's gray zone activities. In terms of President Tsai's leadership, I think the question is better to be answered by Ambassador Wu, Françoise, than myself, because I'm a scholar. So that's all I can say. Thank you.
Thank you. Perhaps, Tomiko, do you want to react to that? To what Dr. Kuo explained about reaction of the gray zone activity? I was kind of critical about of Japan's responses. So do you have any reaction to that? I mean, do you concur with him that Japan should be more original sometimes too?
Maybe there are several aspects or background here. I don't have the time to go into all the details. First of all, in the Japanese kind of governmental system, there has been a quite clear distinction and lines between the self-defense forces and our maritime safety organization. And as Dr. Kuo and those people who are familiar with the Chinese system know quite well, China has been now merging the two. Kind of their Coast Guard is now under their military authority, but it's totally different in Japan. So in Japan, and also procedurally, legally, the government system has been following its own established system and procedures. At the same time, I think there is really a growing recognition within the Japanese government, but also among the Japanese public and also academia, how the Chinese, authorities have been merging the two between the military and Coast Guard authorities, and how they have been also increasing their activities, both intensity, the number of their incursions into our contiguous waters, territorial waters, and also a wider military exercises. So there is growing recognition. But up until now, I think the way the Japanese government has been conducting its own business has been more kind of a traditional way. We will see what they will say in the review that I just mentioned, because within this national security strategy, it's not only the defense in the narrow sense, it's national security. So we are expecting to see in this document, and it's clear that they will also include economic security in that national security. So the new document of the revised version of national security strategy, we expect it to be much wider and probably with more depth than the current one. So after this overall strategy is formulated by the end of this year, we may see some developments, but it's still a bit early to predict. Thank you.
Okay, so let's wait and see. Another question at the front? So please introduce yourself.
Jean-Christophe Long, international consultant. I have two questions, in fact. Question one is related to the last Shanghai organization meeting. India and China had tried to influence President Putin and expressed concerns on the war in Ukraine. So what is your understanding of the impact of these discussions on the Russian president? And maybe it's a question for you, Garima, but also for others countries here in the room. And question two is more on maritime. We discussed the importance of lines of communications in this region, from Suez Canal to Japan, Korea, and so on. So the importance is strategic. How do you see a better maritime security of this line of communications? How do you, what kind of forum do you see to emphasize this? Thank you so much.
Thank you. So the first question.
If I may, I have a follow-up question for Garima regarding the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I'm Céline Pajon, I'm a researcher here at Ifri. Yeah, I wanted to highlight another dimension of the participation of India, because Garima, You said you mentioned the foreign minister saying that there is no good point in separating the West and the rest. And but the SCO is now really changing its nature, I believe. Pushed by Xi and by Putin, really as a kind of anti-West, or at least an alternative for the Western model, or even Western civilizations. So it is a very strong word. So how does India, dealing with that? Thank you.
Great. On your question, sir, on the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and Prime Minister Modi's remarks. I mean, immediately after the remarks, Putin made the infamous sort of declaration escalating the conflict. So obviously the impact has been limited, and I think it's important to keep in mind, because a lot of Western commentators wanted India to play a mediating role, but I think we have to be realistic about the influence and ability of actors to influence Putin right now. I think India is circumspect about it. It was less about putting pressure, more about making a public statement that even though India is participating at SCO, they wanted to highlight Ukraine, the crisis, and that this is not an era of war, as the statement says. Celine, on your question on SCO, that is true. India also fears that China and other actors are making this an anti-West platform and not just a non-West platform. And that is an inherent tension that we see in a number of these platforms, including BRICS, although BRICS has not been talking about strategic issues as much anymore. And there is an inherent tension because India does not want the narrative to be shaped by other countries. At the same time, there is some symbolic value in the forum with the access it provides to Central Asia and Afghanistan, and India not being there perhaps is worse in their calculation than it being there. But this tussle in these new platforms is something that we will see going forward. And as I said, the tightrope, we will have to see how much India continues to engage with it, and if it actually sees value. I mean, India also has a Russia, India, China trilateral. Let's not forget. But my problem is that often, I mean, we are only looking at these through this lens now, but there have been longer conversations about these platforms already, and conversations in the region about the utility of these platforms. And it shouldn't be seen as from such a stark lens, but perhaps at some point this choice will be necessary for India to make.
And about maritime security and well, anybody can respond to this one because everybody is kind of involved and interested.
I mean, I can say just a line on maritime. It's a pretty big question. Maritime security in the Indo-Pacific is huge. The challenges are different in the Indian Ocean region and different in the Pacific. And I do think that with all of these new platforms, including the Quad, there's a reason why there is so much focus on maritime. The India-France aspect has a lot of focus on maritime safety, security, information, MDA. All of this, I think the maritime is the key interest of these countries. So the whole reason, some would say, behind the Indo-Pacific concept gaining ground in the first place. So if your question is what forum, I would say there is no one forum, simply because the theater is so vast, the challenges are so huge that it'll have to be divided, and there will have to be a certain amount of burden sharing among different actors. But looking at the trilaterals that are happening, and very happy to see the France, India, Australia trilateral back on track. I think in these mini-laterals, there is an attempt at some sort of burden sharing in dealing with these challenges. I don't think any one forum is able to address them all.
Anybody else on this specific topic, or is everybody happy with Garima's response? No, Tomiko?
Yes, just let me add that as already said by Garima, this is a very vast area for cooperation because it stretches from east coast of Africa, Middle East, to when we are talking about the Indo-Pacific, it doesn't stop with Korea, Taiwan, Japan. It also extends to the Pacific Islands nations too. So what for Japan, Japan has been kind of quite putting an extra effort. It's a capacity building because as previously mentioned, the need and the interest of each country is different. But whatever you do, you would need some basic capacity of personnel. They would need, again, all the coast guards need some level of ship and personnel and also administration. And all these things will need kind of capacity of personnel. So that is what we have been doing. But each country's needs is so different. And there are so many forums, like, Japan, ASEAN cooperation, ASEAN +3, EAS and the Quad, and there are many others. So we cannot have just one forum fits all. So it's just a multi-layered multitude of cooperation building up is, I think, the reality. And I think that it's the best way to continue. Thanks.
Thank you, Tomiko. Well, I don't see any other hands raised. So before I let you go, I would like to have a very last round of responses from our panelists to a very easy question. What are the major, the key takeaways that you would like us to remember? So my question is, what would you flag as the most important changes brought about by this war in Ukraine for your own respective countries? So changes one in terms of domestic policy and one in terms of foreign policy. So let's start with you, Tomiko. I think it's probably the easiest for you.
It may not be so easy.
Well, I have some ideas, but perhaps that doesn't square what you have
Both
in mind.
domestic and foreign policies are a bit intertwined. Regarding the most important takeaway regarding foreign policy, I think, as I said at the beginning, there is this recognition that we cannot take it for granted that the rules-based order is something that we can rely on. This is really most strongly kind of shown in the way the Japanese foreign policy towards Russia changed so drastically. Because Russia invaded its neighboring country. And you know that we have our own territorial issue with Russia, about which we have been negotiating with some hope and what they have done to their neighbors. So that was a huge shock, as I said, to the Japanese public opinion. So that is probably the most important takeaway. Regarding the domestic, again, it's foreign policy, domestic is kind of vice versa. But I think Japanese public opinion, the public, has also felt this war in Ukraine, not something remote, in something happening in Europe, which is very far from us. Of course, it's geographically still far from us. But we felt like we cannot stay indifferent. It's a feeling that probably we are feeling. Of course, what Japanese government has been doing, what Japanese people are doing, it's probably much less than what European countries have been doing. But still, seen from the Japanese point of view, how they feel about this war, it's something quite different from other conflicts in the Europe after the Cold War ended. Is my take on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Yujen. Your turn.
Thank you. Again, I believe the major implication from Ukraine war to Taiwan is standing out both domestically and internationally. Taiwan's three major identity. Again, Taiwan is a democracy. Taiwan is an island concentrated with strategic high-tech industry. And third one, Taiwan is an island country occupying very important sea and land communication to both Japan and South Korea. So from the Ukraine war, our government and our people learn the only way to deter this kind of possible crisis happening to Taiwan is self-determination. So this year, our government decided to increase largely of our defense budget, occupying 2.4% of our GDP. It's never before. And secondly, we try to apply this asymmetric warfare because we are facing a security threat from a giant. The giant is threatening not only Taiwan, but also to Japan and to South Korea. Based on estimation, China's overall air and naval capacity will continue to grow at 3% each year. So to the end of 2020s, Chinese naval capacity will grow 30%, and it will continue in 2030s. And that's the place our countries are living in, including South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan. China basically cannot stop growing and pushing us. That's the reality, whether you like it or not. And again, secondly, Taiwanese government and Taiwanese people are trying to concentrate our strategic high-tech industry in Taiwan. Again, as a strategic bargaining chip as well, and a shield, a security shield as well. And lastly, again, Taiwan needs to reach out for our democratic partners and allies, and calling their attention to watch the possible moves, stupid moves from China, or the crisis they are, possibly irrationally create in our security environment. Thank you.
So Garima, 2 changes in India?
In terms of domestic policy, while the ordinary Indian might not think of Ukraine every day, commodity prices, fuels, all of that will impact the lives of people already coming out of pandemic and significant economic hardship. In terms of foreign policy, as I noted in my remarks at the beginning of this session, the polarization between Russia and the West and Russia-China partnership growing stronger is changing the strategic environment India is operating in. This will have a major impact on Indian foreign policy. Things that were easier before, perhaps, for example, being part of the Quad on the one hand and the Russia-India-China trilateral on the other, will not be as easy. It will have to make certain choices, but I can say that as long as the China-India relationship continues to be one of tensions marked by, particularly on the border, if that does not normalize, the arc of Indian foreign policy is bending towards the West.
Thank you. Ifri?
Sure. I mentioned about food and energy crisis. I mean, this means the impact of global affairs is directly felt in various countries in the world. In Indonesia, perhaps the public don't and won't understand that these are impacts from external affairs, but they do see that there are some policy changes going on at the moment. But if your question is about changes, I'm not sure to what extent you can actually call these changes in terms of the patterns of policy, at least for a country like Indonesia. Temporary, maybe. Responding to current dynamics, to current issues, but definitely not permanent. I don't really see that, the current changes, adjusting to new food prices, to new energy prices is going to affect permanently Indonesia's policies in some of these issues in the long run.
Okay, and finally, Dr. Wu?
Thank you very
changes
much.
in Korea, if any?
So even though South Korea is not an island country like Taiwan or Japan, but South Korea is like an island because we are not connected to any country by land because of DPRK. So for the domestic politics and the foreign policy directions, as I explained before, that more South Korean people are getting to know the concept of rules-based international order. So maybe it's not satisfying at this stage how South Korean government can respond to the crisis in Ukraine. But I think South Korea, I think under President Yoon, South Korea is moving toward the right direction in terms of foreign policy. So hopefully more South Korean people know what that means and how it will impact the order in the Pacific region, especially like China-Taiwan relations, Taiwan Strait issues. So during the Yoon-Biden summit in May, we included the sentences in the joint statement, how important the security and the stability in Taiwan Strait is. So yeah, maybe it's not satisfying at the current stage, but I can assure you that most South Korean people are knowing and getting to know these issues. Thank you.
Well, thank you for this round of conclusion. And well, join me in giving a big hand to our panelists. Thank you. Well, thanks for your patience.